Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mark Austin, who will be a familiar face to some and a new face to others. But he himself is certainly no stranger to German or to Goethe. Mark read French and German to postgraduate level at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, and he wrote his MPhil thesis on musical elements in Goethe's Die Wahlverwandtschaften. He's since published a number of articles on music and literature, and he's currently preparing a chapter on Goethe and music for Cambridge University Press. Following his time at Cambridge, Mark studied conducting at the Royal Academy of Music, and in 2019 he was elected an associate of the Royal Academy. Recent highlights of his career as a conductor include his debut at the Royal Opera House Lindbury Theatre and the final of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Schulte conducting competition. Mark has worked with orchestras all over the world, from Paris to Hangzhou, China. He is artistic director of the Faust Chamber Orchestra, and with that title, you might detect a theme. And he is assistant to David Hill with the Bach Choir in London, regularly conducting the choir in concert and in the studio. Mark is also active as a pianist. He collaborates regularly with singers, and he's performed at many venues, including the Wigmore Hall. I understand that he has at least 2 recordings forthcoming in 2022, Bach Inspired with the Bach Choir, and an album of English song with mezzo-soprano Anna Harvey. Mark, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture, Isolation Reading in 1944, Richard Strauss, The Complete Works of Goethe and the Metamorphosen. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that very kind introduction. It's a wonderful honor to be addressing the English Goethe Society, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. Hope you can all see me okay. On the 9th of February, 1945, the Innenstadt of Weimar was reduced to ruins by American bombers. The famous Goethe House was partially destroyed, along with most of the city's historic buildings. The 80-year-old Richard Strauss lamented to librettist Joseph Gregor, "Das Goethe-Haus, der Welt größtes Heiligtum, zerstört." A month after the bombing, Strauss began the full score of Metamorphosen, a study for 23 solo strings, based on sketches he had been working on since August 1944. He completed the score on 31st March 1945, and the work was premiered in Zurich in January 1946. In the same period, from autumn 1944 onwards, he read the complete works of Goethe in the Propyläenausgabe. In his sketchbook, Strauss copied out the text of 2 poems, or Xenion, by Goethe, alongside musical themes destined for Metamorphosen. The significance of these texts has not been fully explained, perhaps because musicologists have been reluctant to broaden their studies beyond musical analysis. Despite the success of Metamorphosen in live performance, scholars have not always been so enthusiastic about the piece. Michael Walter described it as nichts anderes als die Beschäftigungstherapie eines alten Mannes, der auf den Tod wartete. Now, arguably, since most creative activity is a type of Beschäftigungstherapie, this is not a particularly helpful contribution. Strauss's tendency to ironize his own work hasn't helped either. In 1943, he famously wrote to musicologist Willi Schuh, "Mein Handgelenk beschäftige ich notgedrungen mit unnötigen kompositorischen Fingerübungen, da man doch nicht den ganzen Tag lesen kann." But to a listener, even without any background knowledge, the experience of hearing Metamorphosen is an extremely powerful one. The work is clearly much more than a divertissement. Written in one movement, it falls into 3 evidently audible sections. In the first adagio section, several contrasting themes are heard. passed around combinations of instruments to create a rich tapestry of constantly evolving melody. One of these themes is highly distinctive, starting with 3 repeated notes on the same pitch, then a descending minor scale set to a snapped dotted rhythm. The character is funereal, and it will turn out to be an echo of the famous funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica symphony. In the second section, this funereal motif is less present, and other more energetic themes are combined in a pattern of gradually increasing energy. The mood is lyrical and passionate, and the sense of growth is reflected in the sequence of tempo markings. Etwas fließender, poco più mosso, appassionato, agitato, poco accelerando, noch etwas lebhafter, più allegro, accelerando. At the climax of this build-up, the music abruptly returns to the adagio tempo of the opening, launching the third section, which seems to reprise the beginning. This time, though, the gradual interplay of themes is suddenly interrupted by a silence, and then the funereal motif is played insistently and violently across the ensemble. There is further development leading to the remarkable ending of the work, which makes a powerful impression in performance. A direct quotation from Beethoven's Eroica is heard, as the violin melody of the symphony's second movement, labeled by Beethoven as a funeral march, is played low in the double basses, creating an unforgettable, somber moment of recognition in the listener. Just like to play for you now that moment from the Beethoven. This is a recording of the New York Philharmonic with Leonard Bernstein. There we are. So the famous second movement of Beethoven's Eroica. And now in a rather abridged version of Strauss's masterpiece, I'm also going to play you the very end of Metamorphosen. There we are. So the opening of the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica. Now let's hear how Strauss uses that theme in the double basses at the very end, after 25 minutes or so of Metamorphosen. Here is the moment where that appears. This is an old recording of the Vienna Philharmonic with Herbert von Karajan, transferred from LP. So there's a fair amount of audio hiss. Yeah, so the immensely moving ending of Strauss Metamorphosen, obviously, I urge you to listen to the work in its complete form, if you haven't already. To study this work is to confront a series of enigmas, in particular, the meaning of that quotation from Beethoven's Eroica. In the score at this point, Strauss wrote In Memoriam above the music. Why did he do this? Then there's the title itself, Metamorphosen. Why is it in the plural? We can see from the sketchbooks that the title was only written down long after he had already begun work on the music itself. Another question is the relation of the work to its immediate historical context. One Dutch critic who heard the work in 1947 described it as an elegy for Hitler, just as Beethoven had warned the lost ideal of Napoleon in his Eroica symphony. Although this has generally been rejected, the work has consistently been interpreted in the context of Strauss's relationship with the Nazi regime. This aspect is amplified by certain myths surrounding its origins. The widespread notion that Strauss made a personal confession of his own culpability with this work has led to the promulgation of one myth in particular, namely that Strauss did not attend the premiere. According to this account, which appears almost universally across scholarship, Strauss asked to conduct the final rehearsal himself and appeared overwhelmed with emotion. He then chose not to attend the concert, which is duly interpreted as an admission of the profound guilt expressed in the music, for which he felt unable to accept applause. This narrative appears in almost all scholarly discussions of the work. However, newspaper reviews of the concert seem to contradict this. For example, in the Zurich newspaper Die Tat, we find, als nach kurzer Stille der Beifall einsetzte, erhob sich der greise Meister, worauf ihm wärmste Ovationen zuteil wurden. It's clear that some further work is required to establish which of these accounts is more credible. The final enigma concerns the two Xenion by Goethe, written in the sketchbooks next to Metamorphosen. These texts have not been given the attention they deserve, and I hope to redress that imbalance in order to demonstrate that Strauss's reading of Goethe and his view of Goethe as the high point of European culture are essential to understanding Metamorphosen. In order to advance the argument, we need to examine first Strauss's old age view of European culture, then Strauss's working methods as a composer and his use of poetic texts in relation to music, his relationship with Goethe and the Xenion themselves, and then finally we'll be able to embark upon an interpretation of Metamorphosen. The notion of the Goethe House as der weltgrößtes Heiligtum is perhaps surprising in a musician. This originated from Strauss's lifelong dedication to the ideal of Bildung. He was set on this path by his father Franz, a celebrated horn player, who had taught him to appreciate the classics of both music and European literature. This dedication to Bildung was mirrored by Strauss's school education. At the age of 81, Strauss commented that he could never have produced his musical work without the education at the Gymnasium, which he described as the benevolent guardian of European culture. Here is his rather idealized old age perspective on that culture. Griechenland war der glückliche Boden, dem zuerst eine Kultur entwachsen konnte, die durch die gemäßigte Kraft des mitteleuropäischen Klimas und den Reichtum und die Schönheit der Landschaft gefördert, vorzeugend in ewiger Steigerung über Dante, Michelangelo, Raphael, Grünewald, Shakespeare, Kant, Schopenhauer, Schiller und viele andere bis zum letzten Gipfel Goethe, der Menschheit ewige Geisteswerte geschenkt hat. Note the reference to the letzten Gipfel of Goethe, a suggestion that the chain has come to an end. He takes a similarly uncomplicated view in his understanding of music. Ich kann nur in Musikgeschichte denken, und da gibt es nur einen ganz schroffen, wagnerischen Standpunkt. Die Klassiken von Bach ab bis Beethoven, von da nur die eine Linie, Liszt, Berlioz, Wagner und meine bescheidene Wenigkeit. As with literature and philosophy, perfection has been reached in German music. Die Mozartsche Melodie, die Beethovensche Symphonie und das Wagnerische Orchester sind Ende und Höhepunkt der Weltkultur. This notion that the achievement of perfection implies a cultural endpoint is reinforced in some detail. Nach der Erschaffung der deutschen Musik durch Johann Sebastian Bach, nach der Mozartschen Melodie und nach den Prachtpalästen der Beethovenschen Symphonie hat endlich der dramatische Dichter und musizierende Philosoph Richard Wagner in der Sprache des modernen Orchesters den germanisch-christlichen Mythos in vollendeten musikalisch-dramatischen Schöpfungen erlösend, eine 3000-jährige Kulturentwicklung abgeschlossen. This narrative does not stand up to critical analysis, of course, but it is useful as an expression of Strauss's view at the time. Interestingly, there is no reference to the destruction of Germany in the Second World War. The endpoint of culture had been reached purely as a consequence of its own organic development. As a young man, Strauss preferred to absorb the kind of cultural knowledge referred to above through self-education. In 1883, he left Munich University after just one semester, writing, "I soon opted for the acquisition of that kind of knowledge through reading and making my own choice of teachers." He kept a notebook in which he jotted down thoughts about his reading alongside sketches for musical projects. At the same time as pursuing his self-education, he developed a compositional working method which would remain constant throughout his life. He noted down musical ideas in oblong sketchbooks, mostly in pencil. These would be written on 2 staves and usually included a melody with some harmony. The sketches are usually thematic in nature. All details of orchestration, dynamics, and articulation are omitted. It's curious to note that the characteristics of Strauss's music, which we most value today, namely his joyous orchestration, extremes of dynamics, are nowhere to be found in the very first sketches of his pieces. The next stage would be particelles, which would be a continuous sketch of the whole piece, usually still on 2 or 3 staves. Some details of orchestration would be noted, and there are references to programmatic elements of the score. This particelle would serve as the precursor of the full score. In the full score, Strauss would orchestrate the full work and fill out any remaining gaps in the material. In the case of songs, where a text is involved, comments by Strauss allow us to identify 2 forms of inspiration. In the first, the most obvious one, the poem was primary. He wrote, "Reading the poem gave rise to the musical inspiration. I immediately jotted down the song." In the second form, the music came first. Many songs owe their origin to the circumstance that the composer looks for a poem that will match a fine melodic idea and the poetically musical atmosphere. As a performer, I find this a particularly interesting remark. Gives me a lot of pause for thought when interpreting Lieder. It's well known that Strauss sometimes wrote his operatic music before receiving the text as well. For instance, in the closing scene of Der Rosenkavalier, he instructed Hofmannsthal to make changes to his precious libretto in order to fit music already completed before it arrived. This idea that music can contain a poetically musical atmosphere, even without text, first arises in a famous letter to conductor Hans von Bülow in 1888. Will man nun ein in Stimmung und konsequentem Aufbau einheitliches Kunstwerk schaffen und soll das selber auf den Zuhörer plastisch einwirken, so muss das, was der Autor sagen wollte, auch plastisch vor seinem geistigen Auge geschwebt haben. Dies ist nur möglich infolge der Befruchtung durch eine poetische Idee. Mag dieselbe nun als Programm dem Werke beigefügt werden oder nicht. Strauss is adamant that a poetische idee is indispensable to a composer who aims at vivid communication through music. This position is nuanced by the idea that music must also have its own inner logic. He writes, "A poetic program may well suggest new forms, but whenever music is not developed logically from within, it becomes Literaturmusik. That's to say, music which requires some kind of external narrative, a story, to make sense to the listener." This approach to poetic programs and compositional methods remained constant over his entire output. Walter Verbeck states, the compositional modus operandi that Strauss developed in the years up to 1900 served him for the rest of his life. An equally ingrained habit was Strauss's continual engagement with Goethe. After his early exposure, Strauss developed a habit of reading Goethe in moments of leisure. Convalescing in 1892 in Greece and Egypt, he read Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre and noted in his travel journal, 1892, the Wanderjahre begin. He absorbed Goethe's literary essays while on tour with the Vienna Philharmonic in Rio de Janeiro in 1920. His librettist partner, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, was well aware of his literary interest, and their correspondence is full of references to Goethe, Schiller, and classical literature. Hofmannsthal went so far as to identify a Goethean atmosphere of purification across their three masterpieces, Der Rosenkavalier, Ariadne auf Naxos, and Die Frau ohne Schatten. There are, however, relatively few settings of Goethe texts by Strauss. He explained why himself. A perfect Goethe poem doesn't need any music. Precisely in the case of Goethe, music weakens and flattens the words. Charles Humans argues convincingly that the few poems Strauss did set were often responses to moments of creative crisis. This begins with Wandrer Sturmlied in 1885, written in the style of Brahms, whom Strauss idolized at this point. Strauss visited the Goethe house in Weimar with Brahms and examined the author's manuscripts, letters, and diaries. Yet the work shows the influence of Wagner too, and it can be read as a working out of two antagonistic musical forces. Goethe's faith in genius to empower the artist provided inspiration to an ambitious young composer as he wrestled with two dominant predecessors and found his own path. Strauss commented that composing the work had been difficult because the piece needed to be, and I quote, in form and content as deep and philosophical as possible. This is an early example of his intention to imbue music with several layers of meaning. The next important Goethe project was the setting of the Singspiel Lila in 1895. Strauss discussed it extensively with Cosima Wagner. At this point, Strauss was disenchanted with Wagner's insistence on the metaphysical significance of music. And slightly surprisingly, writing to Cosima, he said he wanted to compose Lila as though the works of Wagner had never been written. This reflects Strauss's move away from Wagner's inward-looking spirituality towards what Adorno rather ungenerously called the unmitigated exteriority of the tone poems. And it's true that in the tone poems, Strauss aims almost exclusively at describing external events, actions, appearances of natural landscapes. Very rarely do we feel inside the characters. Another creative crisis came in 1918. Strauss was at a low point, having had his fortune in London confiscated by the British government. He had lost his position in the vanguard of German music, diminished by the widely held view that his compositions from Der Rosenkavalier onwards were out of touch with the prevailing musical progress. Strauss set three texts from Goethe's Westöstliche Divan from the Buch des Unmuts. The second song opens, Hab ich euch denn je geraten, wie ihr Kriege führen solltet, and expresses defiance of those who criticize the poet's aesthetic choices. The final couplet reads, Seht ihr aber meine Werke, lernet erst, so wollt er's machen. Demonstrating an almost narcissistic self-confidence, Strauss demands that the creative choices of an artist should be considered on an equal footing with political decisions, including in matters of war. Strauss would live to experience another crisis as the Nazi regime caused the destruction of Germany and its culture. Again, he turned to Goethe. In 1944, Strauss consciously identified with Goethe's creative impulse in old age. Ich arbeite so still für mich hin, nach Goethes erhabenem Vorbild. 2 years later, he delightedly pointed out similarities between his own life and Goethe's, referring to ein paar sehr merkwürdige Parallelen im Lebenslauf und der Arbeitsart dieses Allergrößten mit meiner eigenen Entwicklung. I think it's fair to say Strauss rather indulged himself here, but it's not difficult to see why he came to this view. The two figures shared a lifelong creativity lasting into their 80s, an endless thirst for knowledge, the belief in European humanism founded on the ideal of ancient Greece, a phase of youthful iconoclasm, life-changing travel experiences in Italy, tendency towards autobiography, the desire to master all available genres, a turn towards ambiguity as the highest form of aesthetic truth, the creation of a public persona distinct from private reality, and the strong will of a self-proclaimed genius who saw himself as the expression of an entire culture. Strauss's identification with Goethe was strengthened by the decision he made in autumn 1944 to read the complete 45-volume Propyläenausgabe. He omitted only the Farbenlehre. I had in fact hoped to make a trip to the Strauss archive in Garmisch to look at Strauss's copy and examine his sketchbooks, but sadly the pandemic made that impossible, perhaps in the future. From the very limited descriptions available of this, the Propyläenausgabe there, it seems that Strauss made only a small number of margin annotations. One that stands out in the context of our topic today relates to a letter written by Goethe in March 1805. Goethe criticized Autochthonen, die, indem sie aus den Erdschollen hervorspringen und ihres Daseins gewahr werden, überzeugt sind, dass die ganze Welt in diesem Augenblick geschaffen sei und was vorher da war, nur allenfalls in einer trüben und verkleinenden Entfernung erblicken. Next to this, Strauss wrote simply 1933, indicating his realization that the Nazi movement did not fit within the long chain of German cultural values, which he cherished so highly. Unlike other Goethe editions of the early 20th century, which ordered the works by theme, the Propyläenausgabe is ordered chronologically. It's likely this shaped Strauss's old age view of culture as an evolving tradition. As he began his reading, Strauss could look back then on a lifelong commitment to self-development and the acquisition of knowledge, encapsulated in the ideal of Bildung. This was precisely the theme of the two Goethe texts, the Xenion, which he copied out in his sketchbook in September 1944, adjacent to material that would be used for Metamorphosen. He also jotted down a short musical setting of the first of these texts for 4 male voices. So let's turn now to those Xenien. Here's the first of the texts. Niemand wird sich selber kennen, sich von seinem Selbst-Ich trennen. Doch probiere jeden Tag, was nach außen endlich klar, was ist und was war, was kann und was mag. So you hear in that second line this new term really, Selbst-Ich, which Goethe, I think, came up with in this text, the self-I. The second text, wie es aber in der Welt zugeht, eigentlich niemand recht versteht und auch bis auf den heutigen Tag niemand gerne verstehen mag. Gehabe du dich mit Verstand, wie dir eben der Tag zur Hand. Denk immer, ist's gegangen bis jetzt, so wird es auch wohl gehen zuletzt. These two short texts have not received much scholarly attention, although Strauss's musical setting of the first was the subject of a highly influential and, I believe, misguided interpretation by American musicologist Timothy Jackson. he submitted the relatively minor musical sketch to extraordinary contortions in an attempt to demonstrate a motivic connection between the music of the miniature Goethe setting and the massive score of Metamorphosen. There is no such motivic connection, yet Jackson's initial insight was correct. There is a profound link, but as we shall see, it manifests in the form of a poetische Idee. The poems come from the so-called Xenien, which Goethe wrote after 1815. Some of these were published in 6 books over the years 1820 to 1826. The epithet tame indicates a contrast with the biting satirical tone of the earlier Xenion produced with Schiller in response to critical hostility to Die Ohren in 1796. The 2 texts we're considering here were not published in Goethe's lifetime and now usually appear in what is labeled Book 7 by editors of the Xenien. The printed order, which varies amongst editions, is not one determined by Goethe himself, and these 2 texts are not directly adjacent in any editions. The first text deals with the challenge of self-knowledge. It is impossible for the individual, the selbst ich, to escape his or her subjectivity, which means that obtaining self-knowledge from the inside is prevented. The most profound self-understanding may instead come from an external perspective. Within the individual, there's a further divide between the present and past selves. Was ist und was war. Despite the impossibility of complete self-knowledge, the text nevertheless commends daily striving in this direction. And the rhyming of endlich klar with was war seems to hint that looking into the past may permit the greatest comprehension. Let's listen now to Strauss's musical setting of this first text, Niemand, sich, selber kennen. This is a private recording which I commissioned from a colleague. The original is for 4 male voices, and I was able to ask my colleague to record all the parts in a multi-track version and then lay them on top of each other. So it's not a polished version by any means, but it gives a sense of how the music sounds. Niemand wird sich selber kennen, sich von seinem Selbst trennen. Doch treu wir jeden Tag, was noch außen So that may well be the world premiere recording of that piece. I hope you enjoyed that. It's useful to get a sense of how Strauss understood the poem. The closely spaced writing of 4 male voices, as opposed to a full choir with female voices, helps create, I would say, the atmosphere of profound interiority with the parts very close together. The mystical feeling of the text is mirrored in the wide use of keys in the music. It moves through several tonal centers without any sense of stability. There's that awkward short, long gesture, which occurs a number of times, which again just slightly disrupts the pace of the music, creating a feeling of uncertainty. And then at the very end, that gesture ceases, and we open with just one full long note on was mag, which seems to hint at future potential. The temple at Delphi of Apollo famously bore the inscription, "Know thyself." Goethe addressed this in an essay. Hierbei bekenne ich, dass mir von jeher die große und so bedeutend klingende Aufgabe "Erkenne dich selbst" immer verdächtig vorkam, als eine List geheim verbündeter Priester, die den Menschen durch unerreichbare Forderungen verwirren. Der Mensch kennt nur sich selbst, insofern er die Welt kennt, die er nur in sich und sich nur in ihr gewahr wird. Self-knowledge is thus best acquired by understanding the world. This insight links the first poem to the second poem, and it is possible that Strauss alone has correctly identified them as a complementary pair. This interpretation is supported by the occurrence of the word Niemand in both texts. Strauss intended the second poem to form the concluding part of the choral setting and left 4 blank pages in his sketchbook for that purpose. The tone is different in the second text, which perhaps counterintuitively supports Strauss's pairing of the 2 poems. Abrupt shifts in register are a common feature of Goethe's Xenien, in which the sentiment of one poem is often completely undermined by the text that follows. As Strauss illustrated in his music setting, the first poem is mystical, evoking the holy grail of self-knowledge with the obscure neologism selbst, ich, and the incantatory repetition was ist und was war, was kann und was mag. The second text, by contrast, employs a more conversational tone, with the modal particles aber und eigentlich undermining the mystical language of the first poem. The conversational tone undercuts any pretensions to achieving full understanding of the present. The only way forwards is to trust that the past will offer a model of how things will develop. The 2 poems together thus create a strong poetische Idee, just as Strauss had demanded as a prerequisite for powerful musical composition. The Idee can be summarized as follows. Self-knowledge is best achieved by continuously trying to adopt an outside perspective on oneself. However, no individual can achieve comprehensive understanding of the present. Engaging with the past can strengthen self-knowledge despite a present which appears beyond understanding. This is the poetische Idee which lies behind Metamorphosen. We can now turn to an interpretation of the work. Metamorphosen, the title in the plural, reflects Strauss's recognition that he had created a work with multiple layers of meaning. Across these layers, the poetische Idee undergoes a series of metamorphoses, which are all expressed in the music. This is a good moment to point out that a verbal argument like this cannot possibly do justice to the complex emotional and intellectual experience of this music, but it does provide an insight into the conceptual foundation of the work. The primary manifestation of the poetische Idee reflects the content of the Goethe texts. The striving for self-knowledge is represented by thematic metamorphosis within the music. Each musical theme is related to the others by shared elements or common intervals. This technique, which Strauss probably learned from Wagner, allows the texture of the music to evoke the individual self, which changes continuously through Bildung and yet retains a sense of unity. The texture of the music becomes a representation of the human mind. The past self is evoked in the musical fabric by Strauss's brilliant use of the Beethoven quotation. As the piece draws to a close, the Beethoven moment creates a bridge between the listener's past and present selves. As the quotation is recognized, the listener simultaneously revisits a prior memory of the music. This means that the moment in the past when they originally absorbed Beethoven's music is mapped onto the present moment at which the quotation sounds. This conjunction of the past and present selves should be cause for delight. But the funereal origin of the Beethoven theme, its transposition far down to the ominous low register of the double basses, the alien harmonies which surround it, and the fact the listener is only allowed to hear it in its fully recognizable form at the very end of the piece, mean that the moment is rendered deeply unsettling. Scholars have not noticed that Strauss's deliberate obscuring of the Beethoven reference until the end of the work may have been inspired by Goethe's poem Die Metamorphose der Pflanzen. Alle Gestalten sind ähnlich und keine Gleichheit der anderen. Und so deutet das Chor auf ein geheimes Gesetz, auf ein heiliges Rätsel. The hidden connection of the opening funereal motif to the Beethoven quotation at the end, deliberately avoided at the start, seems to be ein geheimes Gesetz. The eponymous title of Strauss's composition and the organically evolving music in the manner of a chain, or as Goethe puts it, a ring der ewigen Kräfte, do invite comparison with the Goethe poem. We know Strauss chose his title midway through composition, and likewise claimed to have become aware of the Beethoven resonance only partway through sketching. Perhaps, in both cases, the crystallization of the final form of Metamorphosen was inspired when Strauss came across the Goethe poem during his reading. However, there is no documentary evidence to support this, and we can only speculate. Thus far, we have seen how Strauss's music based upon the poetische Idee expresses the predicament of an individual seeking self-knowledge. In its second form, or metamorphosis, the poetische Idee acts within a wider frame of reference, allowing the music to respond to the specific historical context as well. Germany lay in ruins, following a development which seemed to have gone badly wrong. If Strauss had previously been inclined to interact with and sometimes support the Nazi regime for the sake of his family, his career, and his art, he now saw that Hitler had caused the destruction of everything he valued. In this reading, Germany itself becomes the subject. The poetische Idee now encompasses Strauss's belated realization that Germany's self-knowledge had been sorely lacking, as each present moment led the nation down a path away from the achievements of its past towards what now seemed like total self-destruction. The vast difference between was ist und was war, was kann und was mag, must have felt very bleak in 1945. Strauss's contemplation of Germany's idealized past, in contrast with the ruined present, is symbolized in the middle section of Metamorphosen. The stream of constantly entwining motifs create a sense of abundance. The music seems to inhabit a different space to the adagio opening. But as we saw earlier, this is interrupted by the funereal motif as the music returns to the desolate present. This is a structure very similar to Strauss's earlier tone poem, Tod und Verklärung, which in its middle section sees a man on his deathbed revisit cherished memories of his earlier life before the physicality of his dying body returns him to the present moment. Strauss thus mapped a philosophical defeat in the quest for individual self-knowledge onto the total military defeat of the German nation. In Memoriam, inscribed above the funeral march from Eroica, represents Strauss's commemoration of the millions of lives lost as a result of the German nation's lack of self-knowledge. However, it must be said that for all Strauss's supposed advocacy of European humanism, this did not seem to influence his response to the personal suffering of German citizens under the Nazi regime. 462 people died on a single day in Weimar as a result of the bombing raid on 9th February 1945, which hit the Goethe House. Strauss's letters do not indicate much engagement with this horror and suffering of war. And his inscription of In Memoriam on the manuscript, much as it moves us today, probably mourned an abstract idea of the German nation rather than its individual citizens. Continuing the interpretation in line with Strauss's tendency towards abstraction, the historical context undergoes a metamorphosis of its own. the ruined cities of Germany become a symbol, an expression of Strauss's view of the general state of European culture, which in his eyes had reached an endpoint with Wagner and Goethe. As we saw earlier, Strauss found no difficulty in aestheticizing reality, proudly equating the choices of an artist with the momentous decisions of wartime leaders that could touch the lives of millions. The extreme historical situation in which Metamorphosen was composed allowed Strauss to infuse the music with a symbolic illustration of the death of culture too. The evolving tapestry of musical motifs in Metamorphosen reflects European culture as a process of gradual development over thousands of years. The Eroica funeral march, originating with the central figure of Beethoven, is a lament at the mortality of this great tradition. In Memoriam here applies to the entire 3000-jährige Kulturentwicklung, which, having achieved perfection, now enters a phase of decline. I have demonstrated how the poetische Idee undergoes a series of metamorphoses as Strauss evokes in music situations of the human individual, the German nation, and European culture. There are two further metamorphoses which animated Strauss. One was the matter of performance, in which the printed notes of the score must be transformed into a coherent live interpretation. Of course, the composer cannot control performances once the score is published. An example of how the meaning of the work may ultimately be shaped by the performer is provided by a famous recording of Metamorphosen conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler with the Berlin Philharmonic in 1947. It's a live recording and a moving historical document preserving the coughs of people who lived through the destruction of Berlin. The music is played with an intensity that stuns at first listening. The funereal motif is immediately foregrounded in the texture, played at a brisk tempo with a burning intensity from the start. The middle section, rather than evoking the lyrical atmosphere of an idealized past, is whipped up into an almost manic frenzy. The fine detail of Strauss's polyphonic writing is sacrificed to an unrelenting sense of urgency. If this music was solely about Germany's agonies under the Nazi regime, this interpretation might be justified. However, it's clear from our analysis that Strauss intended to express a great deal more in this work. Ultimately, though, he had a performer's mindset, and most likely he would have accepted Furtwängler's interpretation, which combined the creative vision of an exceptional artist with Strauss's masterful score. I conclude with the final metamorphosis commemorated in this work, that between a reader and Goethe's texts. As Strauss began reading the 45 volumes of the Propyläenausgabe, he commented, "I will be young again with Goethe, and then once again old with him, in his way, with his eyes." Strauss hoped that reading the complete works in chronological order would bring him as close as possible to Goethe himself. The intensity of Metamorphosen, with its sustained musical mastery, and in particular its lyrical middle section, which captivates the listener with its exploration of unexpected turnings, serves as a vivid musical illustration of Strauss's sheer delight at reading Goethe. In listening to this music, we in turn briefly enter the persona of Strauss reading Goethe, in his way, with his eyes. It's remarkable to have this encounter memorialized in music. Although the horrors of the Second World War, symbolized by the destruction of the Goethe house, overshadowed Strauss's reading, they did not lead to the destruction of Goethe's works, nor of Strauss's ability to respond to the moment in music. The masterpiece Metamorphosen thus bears witness to the enduring power of art and allowed a distant light to penetrate the darkness. Thank you very much.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. That was just absolutely fantastic and really moving. I think we probably all want to go and listen to the Metamorphosen right now, but instead of doing that, we're going to have some discussion. I would remind everyone that this is being recorded. If you are happy to appear in the recording, please do switch your cameras on. It's nice to see everyone, but that of course means that you're giving your consent. If you don't want to appear in the recording but you'd like to ask a question, just put it in the chat and I will pick it up. Otherwise, please just use the raise hand function and unmute yourself when I call on you. Yes, Pluto. Thank you.
Yes, Mark, thank you so much for this terrific talk. It was really more than illuminating and in so many ways revelatory. I think you've demonstrated brilliantly how Richard Strauss, to use Nietzsche's famous phrase, rather read Goethe with his ears. And I think this is something which I think we all admire, the way you brought together Strauss's reading of Goethe, and indeed the significance of Metamorphosen. Now, I just have a supplementary point here, if I may, because I had the privilege, in fact, a few years ago, to look into the Propyläen edition of Strauss in Garmisch, in the archive, and I would like to simply point out that the way in which Strauss annotated the Propyläenausgabe, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are not so many such annotations there, but they are significant. And they are significant in the sense that what Strauss did was he highlighted, interestingly, all those comments by Goethe against authority, against state authority. That I found absolutely gripping, because it just shows that from 44 onwards, he needed an ally, as it were, in this dramatic scenario towards the end of the Third Reich. And I was wondering, to what extent would you argue that the three songs from the Westöstliche, after all composed, interestingly, in 1918, to what extent can we also see them as an equivalent, in a sense, not exactly to Metamorphosen, but to the way in which Strauss wanted to find in Goethe already then some sort of ally against a, shall we say, regime that he felt also increasingly uncomfortable about, namely the Kaiserreich.
Thank you. That's a fascinating question, and I'm very pleased to hear about your experience reading the Propyläenausgabe. I'm not an expert on the history of the Kaiserreich, but I would say that I think probably what we get in 1918 in Strauss is somebody seeking to assert his own authority. I'm not sure whether he is reaching out to Goethe to comprehend Goethe, so much as simply using Goethe to establish his own presence as a composer in the face of the sort of abandonment, I suppose, by the German public, the musical world, of his own direction. And I think I suppose he might have identified with Goethe's own sense of isolation in his later periods. But I would say probably Strauss we know from most of his writings and his personality that he was always bordering on narcissism and believed in the value of his own art. And I would say he was probably primarily concerned with establishing his own authority. But I'm very open to challenge on that.
Who else would like to ask a question? Well, perhaps while people are brewing their questions, Mark, could I ask a little bit more about the notion of metamorphosis itself? Obviously, you talked about the role of die Metamorphose der Pflanzen in the compositional process. How far do you see Strauss being really in tune with Goethe's notion of metamorphosis? Does he move away from it also?
That's a very interesting question. So I deliberately avoided that slightly in my lecture because I think it's very difficult to know what Strauss's concept of Goethe's version of Metamorphose would be. I think it's very easy for us nowadays to go to the Goethe Handbuch and you can find a compilation of all the relevant texts. And I don't think Strauss had that possibility. We do know that in his opera Daphne, composed in the late 30s, the figure Daphne, in line with the story from Ovid, is transformed into a tree. And Strauss's correspondence at that time with the librettist uses the term Verwandlung throughout. The term metamorphose never appears. So I think my hunch would be that Strauss's serious thinking about the idea of metamorphosis happened in concept with that, in conjunction with that opera. And he then, in a sense, built on that in the work we have before us today, and simply affixed the title Metamorphose without probably much serious engagement with Goethe's view of the term. But that's just my instinct, and it's a rather sort of anti-Goethe one in a sense. So I'm also open to challenge on that.
Thank you. That makes good sense. Yes, Rüdiger Garner again. Thank you.
If I may, sorry to come back. I just find it puzzling that we have, of course, two key concepts at the beginning of Strauss's career, namely transfiguration, death and transfiguration, you alluded to it, and from transfiguration to metamorphosis. The one is 1889, the first one. And how do you view this in itself transformation from transfiguration to metamorphosis? Is there any mileage in exploring this at all from your point of view? I mean, musically, you argued along those lines, I thought, but perhaps we can have another comment from you on this puzzling, shall we say, shift in terms of conceptual emphasis.
Thank you. Yeah, that's another fascinating issue. I think I'm not sure whether it's possible to identify a serious difference between transfiguration and metamorphosis in Strauss's thought. He was not a particularly systematic thinker. He was extremely interested and engaged very seriously with ideas. But I don't think it's possible to trace those thoughts in such a detailed way. I think you could argue in a way that they're all very similar. Scholars have drawn parallels between Tod und Verklärung and Metamorphosen. They both center around a C major, C minor journey, and they both have this division into three sections, as I mentioned. But I suppose the next step in my investigation would be to do a very detailed comparison of those two and try to find out more about the notion of Verklärung in the earlier work. Do you have any further thoughts on that, I wonder?
Sorry, I think Nick is first.
I was, of course, delighted to hear that Strauss thought that Goethe couldn't be set to music, or at any rate that it destroyed large parts of what we value about Goethe's poems. But I wondered whether he had any more specific comments about the many predecessors he had who had tried to set Goethe, some of whom I think probably we'd have to say did it rather well.
Thank you. That's very interesting. The quotation I mentioned, actually, that Goethe's poems don't require music, is followed immediately next by Strauss commenting, this applies to Brahms's songs. And so he, in particular, accused Brahms of creating wonderful music and sort of slightly imposing texts on the top. I know that much. I'm not sure, to be honest, of Strauss's views on Schubert, say, or Schumann. That's a very interesting avenue, which I will explore. Thank you.
I seem to remember there is a quotation somewhere from Brahms to the effect that perfect poems do not need music.
Yes, I think
having written a lot of songs, of course, himself, but I think in that modest sense, suggesting that a perfect poem, and some of Goethe's poems must surely be accepted as perfect, a perfect poem is complete in itself, and music is, in a sense, supererogatory.
Yes, I would, as a performer myself, I would absolutely agree with that. Some of the greatest song cycles we have, for instance, Die Schöne Müllerin, if you read the poems by themselves, they're clearly not perfect. And I think actually the greatest leader are where the poem has left a little gap for the composer to fill out the space. It's also fair to say that a perfect poem may have several meanings at once, and music finds it difficult to do that. Mendelssohn famously commented that music is so much more specific than language, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but actually it's true. You can't express much, you can't express two contrasting thoughts at the same time in music. So that would mean that a poem which does that is very difficult to set.
Dan.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I wanted to bring up a couple of things that relate to the Goethe house and Strauss. The first is, it came to light a couple of years ago from letters, and that is that Richard Strauss was instrumental in gaining Hitler's personal support for the construction of the Goethe Nationalmuseum, the reconstruction, the extension of it, in 1934, when he was president of the Reichsschrifttumskammer, something that a spell in his life that I think I didn't hear you talk about, but it's probably not directly relevant. So through intervention with Goebbels, he was instrumental in gaining that support, and I just wonder if that bears at all on your paper. But the other thing is possibly more interesting, and that is that you mentioned at the beginning that the house had been partly destroyed, which is correct, and you quoted something. I don't remember if it was Strauss himself saying that it had been zerstört, and in fact, that is probably what Strauss thought, that it had been completely destroyed, whereas in fact it was sort of one end of the house that had been hit by a bomb, but by no means completely destroyed. But that was what was reported in the press, and the regime really played that up into a story of the Western Allies supposedly aiming at the house to help destroy German culture. That was kind of the story that, in fact, continued into the post-war era, that the house was actually targeted, which has been disproven. It was not true. So that's kind of his knowledge base, is simply probably what he read in the papers, unless you know of letters he had from Weimar or something like that. I wonder if that is relevant at all to his response to the whole, to this destruction.
Thank you. Yes, that's very interesting. So on the first question of Strauss's engagement with cultural policies, I suppose, of the Nazi regime, I think you're absolutely right that he achieved some quite great things. He also strove to secure copyright for German composers. And I think it would be fair to say that he was very positive about his appointment to the Reichsmusikkammer, because he wanted to re-establish wonderful things of the traditions of German music. It's hard to track exactly his gradual change of mood, his feelings about the Nazi regime. There are a few isolated incidents, including a problem with Stefan Zweig, when it became clear that the regime would not allow Strauss to collaborate with him. He famously wrote a letter to Zweig in which he renounced any allegiance to the Nazi regime. And this found its way to Hitler, which caused a big upset for Strauss. And it's likely that it's only because of his prominence that he was spared quite a bad fate. But apart from that, it's very hard to know how his thinking evolved. On the matter of the destruction of the house, yes, thank you. I hadn't considered actually the difference between the reality and the newspaper reports that Strauss would have been receiving. And this prompts me to look in more detail at those. It's true, he was in isolation in Garmisch, with very little to do. The stimulus for this whole talk was actually thinking about ourselves in lockdown, in pandemic, stuck at home without much going on. But obviously Strauss was entirely dependent on newspapers for reports. So I'll look into that. Thank you.
It's actually been published a couple of years ago in a huge edition of documents about the Goethe Nationalmuseum, published by Paul Kahl. In volume 2 of that is all the material you could want, including this his support in 1934 being instrumental.
I suppose it is fair to say that we would describe a building as destroyed, even if it wasn't completely obliterated. Certainly today, I think we would use that terminology, but the point is still valid.
Mm-hmm. But the newspaper reports would no doubt have been overstating, if anything, the degree of destruction, because this was regarded as the barbaric work of the Western Allies. But of course, the other argument is that it was a response to the Baedeker raid, so-called, on Britain from Coventry onwards, which the British did not use a response to until, of course, you get to the terrible case of the Dresden destruction and the great fires in Hamburg. So that at that stage, we really were targeting German culture, but only German culture as part of the German population. I mean, it was not specifically a cultural policy. It happened to hit cultural gems like Dresden as part of a wider policy of Arthur Harris.
Thank you, Dan and Jim. Rüdiger Garner again.
Yes, on the subject of destruction, again, Michael Kennedy made the point in his Strauss biography that news about the destruction of the Munich Opera House and especially the Vienna Opera House, that was, from his point of view, the main reason for Strauss thinking in those terms of how can one generate a metamorphosis out of destruction. So I find it interesting that you emphasized very much the news about the destruction or semi-destruction or whatever destruction of Goethe's house in Weimar. How would you rate this? I mean, in relation to, for example, the news of the Munich Opera House and the Vienna Opera House, because as the archive in Garmisch clearly shows, he had comprehensive news regarding the two latter demolitions, destructions.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's fair to say that the destruction of those opera houses where Strauss himself had conducted premieres of his own works affected him very personally indeed. I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, extraordinary to read about the various wartime performances and premieres that were going on. I forget which it is. I think it might be Capriccio, was premiered before the air raid blackout, with people hurrying home while the sirens were sounding. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, the determination to carry on with culture in these houses. So I think their destruction was a grave blow for Strauss. That said, after the war, he was immediately involved in a plan to rebuild Germany's opera system. And I think his sort of wish that art must go on slightly contradicts his cultural pessimism about the ending of the great Western cultural narrative. He actually came up with a plan for two types of opera houses. One would be very much, and he described as an opera museum, in which only works which were generally considered great and of lasting value would be performed, very small number. I think he modestly included Rosenkavalier only in that. Very little, in fact, no Puccini, just a little bit of Verdi, mostly German works. And then the other type of opera house would be the more progressive one, dedicated to less performed works and new works. So you can see, I think, quite a conservative cultural viewpoint there from Strauss. But you're right, I should integrate the disruption of the opera houses a bit more closely into the argument, I think. Thank you.
Any other questions? I certainly have one. It's a little bit more general, I suppose. I was very interested, earlier on in the talk, you were talking about the compositional process and the role that the poem can play. And sometimes it's absolutely paramount, it's the source. And other times it's something that's sort of superimposed afterwards to fit. Do we, and that Strauss, as I understand it, was capable of adopting both attitudes. Is that right? And do we know which mode he's working in when? If that makes sense.
I think usually we have no idea from sources. No, I mean, in a couple of cases, we do know from his letters that he wrote some music and then fitted words to it. I can't think of any specific songs off the top of my head, but I would, as a performer, you do often have the sense that the music seems to be carrying the expression of the total artwork, sometimes a bit more than the text. I suppose particularly in opera, actually, we're used to this in passages where the text might be repeated. And in which case, once you've heard it once, you don't need to hear it again. So then music is given free rein and lyricism takes over. But there are also passages in Lieder where the text is almost incomprehensible in its complexity. The concepts float before your eyes, your ears in such speed that the listener cannot possibly hope to rationalize them in the course of performance. And therefore the music takes over and creates this poetically musical atmosphere he was speaking of. But it would be interesting to try and look at specific songs and identify that tendency, yes.
Well, Capriccio is about this theme, isn't it? Whether it's prima la musica or whether it's the text that is most important. It's a wonderful comedic interaction between a composer and a poet, which indicates that it was very much in Strauss's mind. The whole theme of the question of the priority of the one art form as against the other and how they come together.
Absolutely. I mean, Capriccio, if you don't know it, is like the most glorious seminar. It's really a whole opera about that very specific question of the relationship between music and text. And if you read the libretto alone, it's a profound philosophical dialogue between two figures. I mean, Strauss wrote it with Clemens Krauss, who was in himself a great musician. He was a conductor. So the expertise these two figures brought to this debate is astounding. And just to read the libretto alone is wonderful. But then when you encounter it set to some of the most gloriously beautiful music, it's unique, actually. It's almost a guilty pleasure. So I would recommend that.
I'd like to ask Mark what your experience of conducting and or playing Strauss has been. Have you done the Metamorphosen, or what else have you done?
I've done the Metamorphosen once. So yes, the experience as a conductor is interesting. You have to work very hard to ensure that the right motif comes to the foreground at the right time. We must above all have a clarity of texture, which is why the Furtwängler recording, which I mentioned, I mean, it seems invidious to criticize one of the great conductors of the 20th century, but that recording does not serve the music well in terms of the clarity of its motifs. So I found you're constantly having to help the players know when their motif needs to be projected a bit more strongly, when to back off in the overall texture. And then on the macro level, you have to create the sense of a very long linear narrative. You really need to, right from the first bar, you need to find a way to conceive the music through to that Eroica quotation, so that the audience feel they've taken on an unbroken journey, save for the one very important caesura where there is literally a silence, an interruption. So how to do that is a challenge, and that's one of the mysteries, I think, of the really great conductors, is that this interpretative journey just comes effortlessly, and that's something we're all striving towards.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to ask something before we close? No? Well, I just repeat my thanks very much to you, Mark, for that really fascinating presentation. And thank you all very much for coming. Oh, yes, it's clapping hands. Yes, thank you, Kevin. I thought it was maybe a question, but it's clapping hands. So yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And we will see you all hopefully for the next talk, which I believe is in January. Anyway, that will go around by email. Thank you very much for coming, and we shall see you soon.